Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Park Community Church. Great to be with those of you joining us online, and great to be with those of you here in the room. Looking forward to this little bit of a hybrid model this morning, so should enjoy the time together. For those of you I haven't met, my name's Trevor. I serve as one of the pastors here at the Near North location. So if you could do something for me, those of us joining us online, put in the chat the name of a friend that you really appreciate. Right? You don't have to put their full name, just their first name. You don't need to call them out quite like that. Or even just put their initials, right? But put in the chat the name of someone, a friend that you really appreciate, right? Just somebody that God has brought into your life that's been a blessing. And let's spread some love with that this morning. And for those of us here in the room, just turn to somebody next to you and say, God bless me with you. Right? Whether you came with them or not, just turn and say, God bless me with you. Thanks, Nate. I appreciate that. God bless me with you. And we're going to spread some love that way this morning, because the passage we're looking at today, it's all about love and community. It's all about a community of love. And so if you would, go ahead and grab those Bibles and open up to Romans chapter 12, or navigate on your devices to Romans chapter 12. That's where we'll be hanging out this morning. We'll be camping out in verses 9 to 21 of Romans chapter 12. And just to simplify this for us, if I could break it down into just one idea, which as you'll see is not the easiest thing to do with this one, but I would put it like this. The gospel creates communities of love. The gospel creates communities of love. So if you got something to write with, go ahead and put that down. Scribble it into your journal, type it into your phone, drop it in the chat even. The gospel creates communities of love, because that's the thesis, that's the main idea. And that's what we'll be exploring today in connection with the passage. And as we do that, we do have a table of contents as well. It's going to help us work through this. We've got these 3 points. We've got the fringe effect, we have a loving community, and a different kind of love. We have the fringe effect, we have a loving community, and we have a different kind of love. Quick question, can we move the computer here so that way I can see the chat? Is that a possibility? I'm just throwing that out there. So that's where we're going, those 3 points. We're going to jump into the first one now, the fringe effect. We'll jump into that. So this is what we have here. What I want to do first, before we jump into the passage itself, is just kind of explore some scaffolding. Right, kind of the behind-the-scenes structural supports and what's going on in this passage, and kind of what's playing a significant role in what this passage is talking about. Right, because I don't think it's any surprise to say that this year has presented kind of some unique challenges for us, right, some difficulties that maybe weren't what we were expecting. And I think if we were to just kind of summarize what a lot of us have been experiencing, I think a word that might just sum it up pretty well for us is the idea of disconnection. Right, that what we've been experiencing is disconnection, right, where we're lacking the relationships in the community that we're used to having. We're missing that. Where maybe prior to COVID, we had this sense of belonging to a broader community. We had this sense of belonging here, right, where we would, we'd see our friends here. We go to their house for small group. We would see them meet up for the week throughout coffee. We'd meet up at restaurants. We'd even sit together at church. And we had this sense of belonging because this was our community. Right, this was our community. But what's happened is, I feel like so many of the rhythms and the activities that used to give us that opportunity for connection, they've been taken away. Right? And I hope that we still have some sense of belonging, but even if we do, I don't think it's any stretch of the imagination to say that those things have been severely disrupted. Right? They've been severely disrupted in our lives. And they've left us all feeling so disconnected, like we're just basically on the fringe. Right, and I've kind of been thinking that in terms of this idea of the fringe effect, right? Where basically at any point in the life of a church, you've got people who are at the center of community, right? They're connected, they're engaged, they're plugged in, they have relationships, and they have a sense of belonging. But then at the same time, there's people who also are kind of on the margins, right? They're sort of, they're sort of marginally connected, they're living on the fringe, they kind of feel like they're on the outskirts of community looking in. And that's the place where we can begin to feel this kind of sense of disconnection, like we're not actually a part. Like we show up, maybe we're here for services, but we look around and we sense that there's a community here that we're just not quite a part of. And that cannot be the greatest place to sit in. It's not the best feeling. Right, but I feel like what's happened in this season is so many of those activities and the rhythms and the kind of the events of life that gave us that sense of belonging, they've been disrupted. Right, they've been taken away. And so now it feels almost as if the fringe has taken over everything completely, and there almost is no center. Right? We almost all feel like we're just living on the fringe, and we're struggling to find this sense of belonging that we used to have. Or if we never had it in the first place, it's only accentuated it. It's only made it feel more severe. And that's what I think is the fringe effect. And the question that I really want to ask is why that's the case. But first, I just want to say, put it in the chat, right? If this really is a common experience, say I felt that in the chat. Right? If this is something that we actually all have gone through, we're experiencing it, or something we've been through at a certain point, I think there's even a sense of connection to be found in recognizing that we're at least not alone in this. And there can even be a sense of connection found even on the fringe in this season. And so if you felt that, would you please put it in the chat and say, I felt that. Say, that's been my experience. Because I think there's a connection there for us, even in that. But what I want to do is ask the question, why? Right? Why does this experience leave us feeling this way in terms of disconnection? And I want to look at it biblically. Right? And this is the place where I want to get into some of that scaffolding. Right? Because the answer is that life was never meant to be a solo project. We're actually hardwired. It's hardwired into our nature that we're created for community. We're made for community, and this is what I mean. If we go back, Genesis 1:27, it says this. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. It says it twice to stress it. Male and female, he created them. All right, so the idea is that every person is created in the image of God, right? Every single person in this room and joining us online, every single person who's a part of this experience, we're all created in the image of God, which matters, right? Because it speaks to the significance of every single person and to the dignity that every person deserves. But it also tells us something about our nature, right? Because the logic works like this. If we're created in the image of God, then knowing something about the nature of that God should also give us some understanding of ourselves, right? If we're created in the image of a God, then knowing something about that God's nature should also tell us about ourselves, right? That's the logic, and this is what we see when we look into it, right? That the God whose image we're created in is a God who for all of eternity has existed in a loving community. All right, let me say that one more time. The God whose image that we're created in is a God who's existed in a loving community for all of eternity. Because the consensus of Scripture is that there is one God who exists in three persons. Right? Something called the Trinity, that there's one God who exists in three persons and has for all of eternity. Right? Father, Son, and Spirit. And so it follows from that if we're created in the image of a God who has existed forever in a loving community, then we must be made to find our own flourishing in that same kind of context. Right, which is why the gospel creates communities of love. Because God is a community of love and always has been. Right, the gospel creates communities of love because God is a community of love. And that's the context that we're made for. It's the context we're made to find our flourishing in. And so it's no wonder that this season has been so difficult. Right, because the context that we're designed for has largely been ripped away from us. Right, it's been removed. And no wonder that's difficult. Because we're not made for this. We're not made for disconnection. We're not made for isolation, which is why it's difficult. Genesis 2:18 even says, man is not meant to be, it's not good for man to be alone. We're not made for this. But I do think there's hope. And I think it helps us even knowing this, even recognizing that we are created for a community and that this season of disconnection, it's not supposed to be easy. It shouldn't be easy because it's not what we're made for. And I think that awareness alone helps us, and I think in the same way, seeing that other people are struggling with it in the same way, that helps us as well too. Right? Because I'm looking at the chat here, and I see Adam saying, I feel that absolutely. Scott saying, yep. Christy saying, I felt that. Jenny saying, yep, I felt that. Alice saying, I felt that. Becca saying, I felt that. Kim saying, I felt that. We all have the same experience. Not that it hits us all in the same way, but we're all feeling this sense of disconnection. And I think knowing that that's a common experience and a common difficulty for all of us, that gives us even a little sense of connection in the midst of this season, even on the fringe. But my hope is that it'll actually go beyond that as well. And that whenever this period of time is over, my hope is that in this community, right, that in our church, we'll be filled with stories from this period in time that go something like this, where, I was having a really hard time. And then I got connected in, and that helped me get through. Not that it made everything perfect and I was fine, but it helped me get through. Stories where someone says, yeah, I was really struggling. And then a friend reached out to me, and I got connected back into the group of friends that I'd kind of fallen out of touch with, and those relationships, they helped me get through. Right? Or another one might go like this, right? I was brand new to the city, and I just moved in the midst of COVID, and I was struggling, and I was so incredibly lonely because I had no one. I just got on my laptop for work, and then I'd watch TV at night, and that was basically it. But then somehow I stumbled across this church. Right? And I started watching the broadcasts. I got plugged into the services. I joined a small group, and I started to develop some relationships. And honestly, I don't know how I would have made it through without those. I don't know how I would have made it through. My hope is that at the end of this season, whenever that is, that our church will be filled to the brim with stories like those of connections that God is bringing about in this time to sustain us and to help us through. And so I want to move into the second point now and start to explore the text itself. But before we do, let me just throw this out there. Who's somebody that you can reach out to? Who's somebody you've been wondering about? You've been thinking about how they might be doing, and who's somebody that you can just take 20 minutes for this week and reach out to and just catch up? And maybe it's not so much that you're calling to check in and care for another person. I'm sure that's a part of it. But maybe you've been thinking, yeah, I want to call this person. But they're probably busy, and they're probably stressed themselves, and I just don't want to bother them. All right, let me just give us permission all right now to bother each other, because we need that. Right? We need community. We need each other. And so make the time to connect with somebody. All right, let's go ahead and move into the second point now, a loving community. A loving community. And so what we see here in this passage, when we're going to look into it a little bit closer now, is that Paul is he's talking about what these loving communities look like, how people interact within them. He's describing how they should function. And the context here leading up to this is that Paul has spent a lot of space in this letter elaborating on basically how the gospel brings about our own individual salvation. Right, and how we're supposed to participate in that work, live in a way that promotes that participates in our ongoing work of renewal. But now at this point, he starts to kind of shift the emphasis and focus more on that in terms of community and how our transformation doesn't just take place in the context of our own individual lives, but how it actually happens in the context of a community. Right? Because the gospel creates communities of love, and those are the places where our transformation takes place. And just to put it straight, these are churches. Right? Churches are the communities that the gospel creates, and these are the contexts in which our transformation takes place. And I actually think that's kind of an important note for us to take, important point for us to take note of. Because sometimes we can kind of have this tendency to approach life kind of automatically from this stance of, or from the lens of, individualism. And that shapes the way that we think about the gospel and the Christian life, where we can find ourselves thinking, the gospel, it transforms me. Right, it changes my life. It shapes me when that's true. But what we see from this passage is that the gospel doesn't just transform individuals. Right? It doesn't just make individual Christians, but that it creates loving communities where that transformation takes place. The actual fruit, the actual product that the gospel produces is not just individuals, but it's loving communities. Right? The gospel creates churches where transformation takes place. And we can see that even in our own name as a church, right? We're Park Community Church because the gospel creates communities. And our own individual transformation is always a part of that broader work. It's always a part of that bigger thing that the gospel is doing, in forming and shaping and in creating communities. And in this passage, what Paul is doing is he's describing how those communities should function, specifically according to love. Right, and so I want to start jumping into it now, and basically we're going to do this. We're going to take it verse by verse and just walk through this from 9 all the way to 21. So let's jump in with the first one. This is verse 9 up here. Verse 9. Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Right, let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. All right, so he starts off right at the top saying, let love be genuine, or let it be sincere. And what he means is, let love be the thing that actually shapes the way that you relate with one another. Don't just give lip service to your love for one another and then continue to live however you're going to live. Right, let your love be genuine in that it actually shapes the way that you live and relate to one another in community. And the connection to what comes after this, when he says, abhor what is evil and hold fast to what is good, all right, there's a connection here. And basically what it means is this: to only give lip service, to only give lip service to our love, but to continue to live in the way that we are, right, to live in a way that neglects everything else that Paul puts in this list that follows, is essentially in our relationships. Instead of to cling to good, it's to hold fast to what's evil. And it's to let that shape us, all the while we're holding far away from us what's good. Right? We're reversing that structure, and we're living in a way that's disingenuine with the love that we profess. It's disingenuine, it's insincere, is what Paul is saying. He's saying, don't do that. Don't live like that. Let love actually be the thing that shapes how we relate to one another, how we treat one another. And abhor anything that would lead you to live in a way that's out of step with the gospel, that would treat other people in a way that's out of step with love. That's what this first piece is saying. And then he moves into verse 10 here, where he says this: love one another with brotherly affection. Right? Outdo one another in showing honor. Right? Love one another with brotherly or sisterly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. So he's continuing that same theme of love here, right? And even a love that's familial. And then he begins to, well, what he's calling on there when with the familial love, he's calling on the idea that we've all been adopted into the family of God. Right, that as Christians, we've been brought into the family of God, and in these communities, everyone within them, they're our brothers and our sisters. Right? We're family, and everything that follows is just giving practicality to how we live that out. And the first thing that he says there, in outdoing one another with honor, that's the first practical step for how we do that. And what's really interesting is that he actually frames this as a competition, right? Saying outdo one another in showing honor. And so just imagine, what would it look like if we made it a practice to show honor consistently within our community? Like every time, let's say the next time our small groups got together, or the next time you just got together with a group of friends, you took a couple minutes, and everyone in the group kind of just went around the circle and said something that was honorable to another person, right? Like for example, Joe, so I want to honor you for the way that you've been there for your family, the way that you've cared for them in the midst of a really difficult season. I want to honor for you that. I've always admired you for it. I've just never said it. And I want to bestow honor upon you because of that. Right? Or Susie, the way that you've led this group through an incredibly difficult season, the way you show up week after week after week, I'm so impressed by it. And I've never mentioned it, but I want to bestow honor upon you for that. And I want to honor you for that. I want to call out something that you've done and bestow honor upon you because of it. What would that look like? How would that change our communities if we made it a practice to facilitate the outpouring of honor for one another? So that's verse 11, or that's verse 10. Verse 11 comes along and it says this: do not be slothful in zeal, be fervent in spirit, serve the Lord. Do not be slothful in zeal, be fervent in spirit, serve the Lord. So this is kind of getting at the idea with what the passage before said, and serving one another in connection with spiritual gifts. Right, that if we have a spiritual gift, which as followers of Jesus, if we're a follower of Jesus, we do. We all have one. And if we do, we should then use it for the good of the community. We should be engaged in serving in our community in some way that brings benefit to other people. Right, that's what he's saying here. That's what he's calling out. And I know that the way that this took place prior to COVID was primarily through actual serving roles. Like you served in this ministry or in that ministry. And a lot of that has changed. Right, a lot of those roles have gone away. But I don't think that doesn't mean that there's no opportunity to exercise our gifts. It just means that it's going to take a little bit of creativity. And that is probably not going to happen majority of the time through this designated, pre-described serving role. And so I think the question we need to ask ourselves is not what pre-existing role can I fit into, but just how can I help? Right? What can I do to help this community? How can I use the time that I have, the availability, the resources, even the spiritual gifts that God has given me, the way he's wired me? How can I use these things for the benefit of other people in this community? How can I do that? I think that's what we need to consider. So that's verse 11. Then verse 12 comes and it says this: rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer. Right, rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer. That middle section, when he says tribulation, that just means trouble. Right, be patient in trouble. Does anybody have any experience with that lately? Has anybody been going through some trouble lately? I think what this verse calls out is maybe what most of us have been struggling with more than just about anything in here. All right, because maybe we read this list and we think, rejoice in hope. I haven't felt an abundance of hope lately. All right, be constant in prayer. My prayer life has been anything but constant. And be patient in tribulation. Patience feels like something I lost about 6 months ago. All right, this verse isn't describing me. And I just want to say, if that's you, if that's where you're at, I just want to acknowledge that this is a difficult season, right? And that these things aren't always easy. And I also just want to say that you're not alone in that. Right? You're not alone in that feeling. But let me also say this. Right? When he says rejoice in hope, what he's calling attention to there is the hope that we have for eternity. Right? He's saying that no matter what happens in this life, good or bad, and no matter how long those things last, we will always have God in every season and the promise of an eternity with him. That's our hope, which is a certain hope, right? It's not flimsy. It's something that we can hold on to, and we can rejoice in that reality no matter what we're going through, and we can draw strength from it. And the thing is, I think if we're honest, right, we hear that and we believe that, but it doesn't really resonate with us. If we're honest, we wish that we could just take that and kind of hold fast to it and that would make everything better. But if we're honest, I don't think it does. For most of us, I don't think it just makes all of the trouble and the pain go away. But that doesn't mean that we can't still make the practice of rejoicing in that reality, or to make it a practice to weave that language into our prayers of the hope that we have for eternity and even for the present, that God is still with us, no matter how difficult things are. We can rejoice in that hope even when it feels trite. Because as we make that a practice, it begins to shape us. And we draw strength from that. Right, and as for the other two pieces, right, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer, I really do think slowing down is a significant piece of that. Because when we live at such a fast pace, it's almost impossible to be patient. Not because we're bad people, just because our schedule's too full. Just because we have too much going on and there's no room to be patient. There's no room for interruptions. And so when we slow down, when we live within our limits, it opens up the opportunity to be patient. And it gives us the chance to see all those little interruptions that used to spark anger, right, that used to spark frustration. And we can use those as opportunities to be constant in prayer. Right? Like when traffic's bad and you're frustrated because you can't get to where you want to get, you can see that as an opportunity to pray. Right? Or when you're in the checkout line and it's long and it's slow and it feels like it's not moving, right? It's like the Zootopia scene with the sloth. You can use that as an opportunity for prayer. Right? And it's not that we build these things in and all of a sudden our lives are cheery and we're kind of happy-go-lucky no matter what's going on around us. It's not that. It's that these things, they help us to draw strength. And they help us to persevere. And they help us to feel a little bit of life no matter what we're going through. All right, so that's verse 12. And verse 13 comes in, it says this: contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. All right, so going back to what I mentioned about, we have a tendency to kind of approach life from this individualistic lens. I think that actually plays into our giving as well here when he says contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. Because I think in particular with giving, sometimes we have this tendency to look at it as just sort of this box that we check within the practice of our own faith, right? And it's just kind of a matter of allocating these funds in this part of the budget, and we just kind of ship it off to where it's supposed to go, right? And I get that it's an aspect of worship. It's something that we do within the context of our own relationship with God, and that's great, right? We shouldn't need some pressing need to motivate us to give, right? That's true. But at the same time, our money does actually go somewhere, right? It actually helps real people, as Nate was mentioning earlier, right? Some of our generosity here has gone and helped other people in the midst of the city who have been in really difficult circumstances. Right? And so our generosity, it helps real people in the same way that we've been helped by the generosity of others, and that we've been recipients of it in different times in our lives. And so generosity actually helps real people. And at the same time, this piece on hospitality, I think we can view this as just an extension of generosity when it's understood as going beyond just our finances. Because what we're doing in practicing hospitality is we're being generous with our time, with our space, even with our attention, and that we're giving it to other people. And so I know that there are some constraints with that in this particular season, but I love the way that the Message version, another version of the Bible, I love the way it translates this phrase. It says, be inventive in hospitality. Be inventive, meaning exercise creativity and figuring out new ways to be hospitable, new ways to help people feel welcomed and like they're a part of the community and like they have a sense of belonging. Right now, we need some people to invent some new avenues for hospitality. We need that. So that's verse 13. Verse 14 comes, it says this, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Now, if we were to look into the original language here, you can see the way that the verbs are shifting in the passage. They shift in this particular verse. And what Paul's doing there is he's actually drawing attention to this particular verse. He's putting it in bold and he's underlining it. So I want to spend some time with this one, but this verse actually connects with the latter half of the passage as well. 17 through 21. They're all hitting on the same theme. And so I kind of want to skip this one for now and take care of 15 and 16 and then come back to it. So we'll move on to 15 and then we'll come back to 14. So verse 15 says this, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. It's a simple concept, right? It just means pay attention to those who are around you, and if something is affecting them, then it should affect you too. If something is impacting them, then it should impact you too. And we actually have a really practical way to do this even this coming week. Because this coming Wednesday, it's the first Wednesday of the month where we spend the day in fasting and in prayer as a community. And we've made the decision this month that we're going to focus our attention specifically in prayer and in lament for the Latino community in Chicago. Because COVID-19, it has rocked certain segments and populations and demographics of our city. And in particular, far and above the rest, the Latino community has been hit hard. And we have a lot of brothers and sisters in that community who are weeping because of it. And so this Wednesday, we're going to fast and we're going to pray and we're going to weep with our brothers and sisters who are weeping. We're going to spend the day in prayer and fasting and in lament. And so let me just encourage you, be a part of that. All right, make the point to intentionally be part of that. Fasting and prayer this Wednesday. All right, let's round this out with verse 16. It says this, live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Right, harmony. He calls attention to this concept of harmony, right, which is a beautiful idea because it calls attention to the fact that we are different. Right, that God draws people from all different walks of life and all different backgrounds, and he puts them together in these communities of love called churches, and he weaves their lives together. Right? And I love the idea of harmony because it shows that we actually do live in ways that are different. Right? We play different notes. We live according to different melodies. We've got different instruments. Right? But we come together in a way that brings harmony instead of discord. And I think what he says after this, in the second half of the passage, second half of this verse, is actually key to that becoming a reality. When he says, do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Because what that means is that in these communities, there is no one, there's not a single person who's not good enough for you, who's not good enough for you to associate with, to be in relationship with, to call friend, and really to call brother or sister. Right? Because in this community, we are all brothers and sisters. We're family. Right? We've been brought together. And so there's not a single person, no matter how different they are, no matter how much you might disagree with them on certain things, there's not a single person that you can remove the title of brother or sister from. Because God has brought us together. And at the same time, there's not a single person who's too good for you either. Right? There's not a single person who has too much, who's accomplished too much. There's not a single person who's just flat out better than you. That's not true. Because we're all just brothers and sisters. Right? We're family. And God has brought us together. And the only way that you get harmony is when God brings people together who are different. And that's what we have in these communities. And so when we start to take all of these verses in connection and we kind of add them all together, what we get is we see that what God has done is he's taken the individual threads of our lives and he's connected them in such a way, he's woven them together in such a way that we're so interconnected, right? We're so interwoven that we're essentially inseparable. Right? That the only way to remove an individual thread is to do damage to the entire fabric. And the thing is, as we saw earlier, that's actually the exact type of community that we're made for. That's the context in which we find our flourishing, and it's the kind of community that the gospel creates. Right? That's what the gospel brings into being. And so the point is, if you're someone who throughout this season, you just kind of been living on the fringe, right? You've been hanging out on the margin, you just kind of been hanging back on the outskirts of community. The point is, you need to make a move because you're not meant to be there. You're meant to be part of the community. And so you got to make a move to get plugged in and to get connected because you're not supposed to be disconnected and on your own. And there's a really simple way to do that, right? Probably the easiest way to do that is just to join a small group. And that should pop up on the screen how you do that. It's really simple. You just take out your phone, text Group Connect to the number 22333, and they'll help you get connected. Right? Just a simple step to get plugged into relationship. But I also want to say this, because I know there's a lot of us we've been part of this church for years, and we've been part of small groups for years, and maybe we're feeling that sense of disconnection, and maybe part of what's happened is, we're kind of tired of the Zoom thing, and so our small groups are meeting, but we just kind of decide, this week, and then the next week, we're just not going to kind of jump in this week. Our attendance has kind of been waning throughout the season. And let me just encourage you to make a commitment to that group. Right, to make a commitment to consistently show up and be a part of that group and invest in those relationships in the time that you meet together and outside of it as well. Right, invest in those relationships because you need it, because we're created for community. We need it. All right, so that's the end of the second point. We're about to move into the third now because there's still a significant piece of this passage that we all still have to kind of walk through together. So with that, I want to move into a different kind of love. A different kind of love, our third and final point. And this is what's happening here. Paul is calling attention in the latter half of this passage to the idea that the gospel creates communities that are distinct, right, that are different, that are unique. And it's not just that the church is this kind of backup community or this replacement for people who don't already have one of their own. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that the gospel creates a type of community that's different altogether. It's unlike anything else that's out there. And the way he draws attention to that, it really comes to the fore in verse 14 when he says this, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. And as we saw earlier, right, he's putting this in bold, he's underlining it. If we could look into the original language, you see that in the verbs, but also you see it very clearly in the English that he's repeated himself here. He said it twice just to call attention to this. Right? And so he's stressing emphasis on this point, and we see that what this verse is saying, the theme continues with the latter half of verses 17 to 21. And this is what he says there, 17 and 18. He says, repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Right? Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. The idea there is that we practice a different kind of love in these communities. We practice a different kind of love that extends even to its enemies. We meet cruelty with kindness. We meet curses with blessing. And we return goodness for evil. And that's how we make the consistent effort to live at peace with everyone. It doesn't mean we don't have boundaries, we do, but relationally, our goal is peace. And the strategy for achieving that goal is the practice of this different kind of love that extends even to its enemies. So this is what he says here in verses 19 to 21, the last section of our passage. Beloved. He calls them beloved. Somebody say, I'm loved. There we go. Put it in the chat. Say, I'm loved. I'm loved. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head, which just means that instead of pouring gasoline on the fire, you'll be pouring water. Right? You'll be stamping out the feud. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And so in summary, what we see here is that the gospel creates communities of love that practice a different kind of love. A love that extends even to its enemies, and a love that goes out of its way to be a blessing, even to those that we would rather avoid. That's what this is saying here. And at first, When I was thinking about the application for this, I was thinking, I think this mainly has to do with those who are outside of the church, this latter portion on vengeance, right? That it's talking about people who are kind of for some reason hostile to Christianity. They're just kind of opposed to it. And I thought that was primarily what it meant. And then I was reminded of a story, right? Because I came to faith when I was maybe 19, 20 years old. I came to faith when I was 19, but I was maybe 19, 20 years old at the time. And I was in a church just in a small town that I was living at, and I was in Sunday school. And there was an older lady there who started to tell this story one morning. And she started to talk about how there was one day she was walking down the hallway at church, and there was another woman walking the other direction that she knew. And as she walked past the other woman, she just completely snubbed her, right? She just walked right on past without a hello, without a glance, without even a recognition, right? Just nothing at all. She just walked right past her. And the woman said she thought to herself in that moment, God, did you see that? She just snubbed me. And then she thought, well, God, vengeance is yours. If you know we can be like that, put it in the chat. Say we can be like that. Say I can be like that. Say it even out here. I wasn't expecting to get too many people on that one. It's boldness. And so I appreciate that. I appreciate that. But that reminded me that we can have enough trouble. We can have enough trouble with vengeance and with our relationships even inside of the church. Right? It doesn't have to be people outside. And so I think the application here, it can go either way. Right? It can be your uncle or your cousin or your coworker who's not a believer, and it can be the person in your small group that you just have a very difficult time getting along with. It can go either way. Right? But I think in this season, the most immediate application for us is the political one. Right? It's no secret that we have kind of a big week ahead of us. Right? And there's a lot of emotions tied into it, and there's uncertainty, right? Because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how it's going to go. But I hope that what's not uncertain for us is how we'll choose to respond to those that we differ from. Right? Is how we'll choose to respond to those that we're in opposition to. I hope that as a church, we'll make the consistent practice to practice that different kind of love that extends even to its enemies in this season and beyond. Right? Which I think that looks like taking the person that's incredibly difficult for you to get along with, the person that you intentionally go out of your way to avoid, and figuring out ways to bless them. Figuring out ways to bless them consistently. I hope that we make that a part of our lives. And practically speaking, I think a good first step is prayer. Yeah, absolutely. We should pray for them. But let me challenge us here. I think we should try and figure out ways to bless them that actually involve interacting with them. We should try and figure out ways to bless them that actually involve spending time together. And I think a good place to look for ideas is just in this list that Paul has given us. How can you show honor to them? How can you practice hospitality towards them? How can you be impacted by the things that they're impacted by? Because in doing those things, we're practicing a different kind of love. A love that's genuine, a love that actually affects the way that we live, and a love that the world knows nothing about. And we're practicing the same love that our Savior did when He gave His life for us. Now, as we get ready to close, let me just say this. The gospel creates communities of love that practice this different kind of love, right? That extends even to its enemies. And the reason for that is because it's in the gospel that we've received that different kind of love. We've all received that. We're just passing forward the love that we've become recipients of. And the truth is, yeah, we're all loved, right? I think that's actually what Paul's calling attention to in verse 19 when he says, beloved. He's reminding them of everything I'm telling you to do. I'm telling you to do it because I'm telling you to practice the same love that you've already received. Something he expounded on earlier in the book, back in chapter 5, in verses 7 and 8. This is what he said there. He said, for one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person, one would dare even to die. Right? He's saying as impressive and remarkable and as rare as that is, the gospel is not even like that. He's saying the gospel is actually better because in the gospel, we see this in verse 8. God shows His love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Meaning that while we were still sinners, right, while we were in rebellion, while we were in disobedience, while we were in direct opposition to Him, Christ died for us. Right, while we were using the very breath that He put into our lungs to curse His name, He gave His life for us. He died for us. so that we could have life and so that he could bless us. It's that different kind of love that the world knows nothing about, but we've received it in the gospel. We're loved. Yes, we are loved, and it's that love that we've received. And so the gospel creates communities of love that practice that different kind of love because we're just passing forward what we've already received from our Savior. That's what we're doing, and we've been brought into a community that's being transformed by that same kind of love, just like we are, and they're called churches. That's what the church is. And so the gospel creates communities of love that practice a different kind of love, a love that extends even to its enemies. And so my hope for us as a church and as a community is that in this season and in every season, we'll make it a point to consistently practice that different kind of love, the love that extends even to its enemies, because it's the love that we've all received. Let's pray together. Jesus, I thank you so much for the time together this morning. It really is a blessing just to be here and to be able to look into your word, to sing songs, to declare and celebrate truths that you do turn graves into gardens, that you are a God of redemption. You are a God who practices a different kind of love, something that you can't find anywhere else. And God, we do rejoice in the reality that in the midst of this season, no matter what's taken away from us, we will always have you. We'll have you in this season and in every season for all of eternity, and we rejoice in that reality. And we thank you for the time here together. Would you shape us and would you mark us by that different kind of love? In Jesus' name, amen.